All right, Shalom, Israel. Want to thank you for coming through today and welcome you over here to Maccabees TV. But first thing first, we got to give honor and praise and glory to the Creator in the name of His only begotten, Yeshua HaMashiach, who intercedes on our behalf. And there's two more things I want to talk about here. And the first thing is I want to give a major props to Chief Priest Danyaahla, because he has given us a chance to give our views, our Hebraic views on where we come from, and just different aspects of it. And he doesn't have to do that. And that is a very, very good thing that he is doing that, because it allows Israel to grow, bounce ideas off each other, and then we'll become with a clear and cohesive doctrine in order to push out to the masses, while we all have our own diverse little, things that we all do. And the second thing I want to talk about is burden of proof. All right, because as a nation, we are constantly challenged on who we are. But one thing that people like to do is they like to take the burden of proof fallacy and throw it out the window. You see, if we make a claim on who we is, it's up to us to show evidence of it. And I went out my way because Dagger Squad's been calling us out left and right about we not Israel, we can't prove it, we can't do this, we can't do that. Me and my brother Jashob over on Genesis 49ers, y'all should go check out his YouTube channel. He does a lot of good presentations. We went back and forth with these guys, man, and showed that they don't even know what they're talking about. We got the footage. We ain't put it out yet. We might put it out a little bit later. But I'm going to go ahead and get this presentation out the way. So let me go ahead and share my screen so we can get started. All right, cool. All right, this is Israelites in Nigeria, part 2 by me, Yaakov Ben Israel. So let's just go ahead and get into this. All right, the table of contents. First, we'll be dealing with the cranial evidence at Lachish. And secondly, we'll be dealing with the DNA evidence to support Derek Lang's research and many Israelite positions, because a crazy thing happened when we were over on Dagger Squad's channel. They were coming at us and presenting us different things from Tudor Partif, and then they sit there and try to discredit Derek Lang without even knowing that these two people are part of the exact same organization. Then both of them are going out of their way to show and prove that what we are saying and our claims that we are Israelites is actually valid and true. But they try to pit these two against each other because they don't do thorough research. They don't go and research what groups people are part of, who agrees with who, who's fighting who. They just try to find some microwave scholarship and throw it out to us like we have to accept it. But we're not going to do that. We're going to show and prove ourselves. All right. And the first article we're going to go to is an analysis of crania from Tel Duer using multiple discriminant functions. And this is the abstract. And it's by Soy Kita, someone who Garfield says that he's read every article this man has ever published. So I wonder if he's read this, or if he's just being a master of omission by not telling us about it, or if he just was lying to me about reading everything the man ever published. But here's the abstract. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests that the Iron Age biblical city of Lachish had a multinational population of diverse geographical origins. The multivariate analysis of crania using canonical discriminant functions and metric variables tends to confirm this. The approach employed stresses the population discriminant analysis studies should be both biologically and statistically legitimate. An ecological interpretation of the data suggests a research design for analyzing the affinities of cranial series. Similarities probably should be assessed in an analytical space containing the widest possible range of variation. Okay, and this is an image of Soy Kita. Shamarka Omar Yahya Kita completed his medical training at Howard University and received an MD degree. He studied taxonomy and evolutionary biology with S.T. Husson and D. Dagming in the anatomy department, as well as skeletal biology with the late J. Lawrence Larry Angel of the Smithsonian Institute. He received his in biological anthropology from Oxford University, where his supervisors were noted scholars A.J. Boyce, biological anthropology, and John Baines, Egyptology. And this is just giving some more of his credentials. He's a member of the American Academy of Developmental Medicine and Dentistry, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Anthropological Association, so on and so forth, the NAACP, the Royal African Society, and amongst others. Among his awards, Ford Foundation Fellowship to study at the American University in Cairo, Egypt, an Upjohn Award for Research, Howard University College of Medicine, the Overseas Research Student Award for the Vice Chancellors and Principals of colleges and universities in the United Kingdom. And he's affiliated with the National Human Genome Center of Howard University and the Department of Anthropology of the Smithsonian Institute. He has been interested in the origins of the concepts of race, the misconception of human variation as race, and the scientific approaches to biocultural origins and histories of indigenous African peoples. The background. The archaeological site of Tel Duer is located 20 miles south of Jerusalem. Its horizon spans the Bronze through Iron Age. The site was excavated and crania recovered between 1933 and 1936 by the Wellcome Marston Archaeological Research Expedition to the Near East. The site is associated with the biblical city of Lachish. Tufnell notes that biblical and Assyrian sources suggest that Sennacherib sacked and burned Lachish in approximately 700 BCE, which goes back to the time frame that Derek Lang gave for the Oyo state of the Yoruba and them descending from Israelites who were dispersed during this time period. And archaeology tends to support this date. Lachish at the time was part of the Judean kingdom, which makes it clear. All right. Tufnell gives the following important historical derivative dates associated with archaeological levels as defined at Tel Duer. 1200 BCE is level 4, 1000 to 900 BCE is level 5, and 900 to 700 BCE is level, 1200 BC is level 6, 1000 to 900 BC is level 5, and 900 to 700 BC is levels 4 through 3. Egyptian and Aegean influences are noted at level 6, with evidence for destruction perhaps by Egyptians. Level 5 is reported as concording with historical sources, which suggests that Shishak, the Libyan pharaoh of the 22nd Egyptian dynasty, attacked and perhaps left a garrison of his men. The prevalence of cowrie bells and other non-indigenous objects in certain tomb groups of the period suggests that some of Shishak's army, which included Libyans and Nubians, may have settled in the district. There are also traces of a third influence, and the direction of whence it came may be indicated by the Sphinx amulet with negroid head and hair. And that's dealing with levels 6 and 5. Levels 4 through 3 contain further but confusing evidence of possible Northeast African presence or trade. In fact, Tufnell implies that level 4 is to be distinguished from level 3 because level 4 has Northeast African objects. However, the evidence seems inconclusive since the archaeologists divide the objects into periods based on a general observation of a decrease in the presence of Northeast African materials over time. They do not consider that more assimilated Northeast Africans could have been present during the period represented by level 3, 700 BCE. Most of the Iron Age crania came from tomb 120. Now, tomb 120 is important because this is a known Israelite tomb. You know, a lot of people say that there are no Israelite bones to be found, but that's not true. Tomb 120 is clear evidence from the mass burials of Lachish, which had goods assigned to both levels 4 and 3. It is well to note that several chambers were excavated and found to contain human and animal remains, as well as pottery identifiable as ware of 7th and 8th century dates. These are known known Judean time periods, all in a jumbled mass. And this was true of tomb 120. Perhaps Sennacherib's pillage explains the nature of the burials. All right, interpretation, discussion, and conclusions. The Lachish series is found to plot nearest to the Maghreb and E series, both of whose centroids plot nearer to Romano-British groups than any other series, which at this time period, there are no Romano-British groups, you know. The D2 value between these series is significant, as previously noted. Examination of the classification results when Lachish is run as an unknown shows that the E series receives the plurality, with the Maghreb series receiving a very small percentage. The results seem to indicate that the morphometric patterns of crania in the Lachish series show a great range of variation, with many crania classified into Egyptian and Nubian series, even when Lachish is available as a choice. Now, this is important because if anyone had seen my presentation on Global Media Inc. with Basim, Israel and Mesopotamia, the fathers of Kemet, they would see that the people who are considered these Egyptians and Nubians, the Egyptians being those in the south or in the Delta, and the Nubian being those down there in Ethiopia, these people actually are Asiatic in origin. But let's go on. Even when Lachish is available as a choice, this suggests that the Lachish series might contain crania from these areas. Historically, it is known that Egypt had long been in contact with this area, as noted earlier. The Bible, 2 King, recounts the destruction wrought by Sennacherib and suggests an alliance of the Judean kingdom with Egypt during the time of the 25th dynasty, when Nubia ruled by Egypt. Nowhere is it more vividly revealed than in this warning to Sennacherib as he approached Jerusalem. Behold, Taharka, the Ethiopian Nubian, has come out to fight against thee. 2 Kings 19:8-9. Taharka was one of the pharaohs of the 25th dynasty. And what's clear to me is that scholars have no issue quoting the Bible and its historical content. But it seems that we have people in this so-called conscious community who feel like the Bible can't be referenced in any way. Then why are PhD scholars referencing it? Anyway, going on. The notable classification of Lachish crania into Northern Egyptian but not Maghreb series suggests that it is not helpful to stereotypically generalize about the morphometric peoples in North Africa. This Maghreb series is actually quite morphometrically heterogeneous, which means it's different, different populations there. The classification of a number of crania into Romano-British series is noteworthy and suggests evidence for Romano-British presence. This is, of course, impossible since there was no Romano-British during the time of the Judean kingdom, nor were there any first dynasty Egyptians, etc. So it's saying that these cranials that were found not only match the first dynasty Kemet skulls in the Delta, where the Asiatics were, but it also relates to the Romano-British population during the time of the Roman Empire. And the reason it relates to them is because, again, there were Israelites that went to this land, and there's DNA evidence to support that. And they did have sub-Saharan African elements, but we'll get to that later. It can be said only at the best that these crania morphometrically resemble the various other series at the group or individual level. Theoretically, only groups which in reality an unknown series could be affinities or identities with can or should be used. This is clearly not the case here for most series. If the Lachish series crania are accepted as truly being of the date assigned to the site by archaeology, this reality axiom is especially true when the individuals of the Lachish or any other series are evaluated as unknowns. Now, this is important because we're going to get to these unknowns later. The results are in terms of specific identities, and it's important that we know that the results are in terms of specific identities because we're going to find out these specific identities are Israelites. It is clear, as implied earlier, that the idea of similarity must be informed by a larger theoretical framework. Okay, skipping over all the names. All these scholars find a position and significant correlation between nasal index and humidity and or vapor pressure, and a negative correlation between nasal height and temperature. Krognier and Hirnox and Froment both find a negative correlation between bizygomatic breadth and temperature. Krognier demonstrates a negative correlation between facial height and mean annual temperature in the Mediterranean area and Europe. This is also true of more tropical Africa. Again, modulated by humidity, such as very hot, dry areas are associated with relatively narrower faces and noses, which is the past gave rise to the problematic theories of ancient European or Europeoid mass invasion, for which evidence is non-existent. Here Knox has parsimoniously explained this phenotype as a result of local micro-adaptation. And parsimoniously means they regretfully admit that these things are also analogous to tropical Africans, which they consider us a part of. A study of Howell's results in Guglielmino Mattesi demonstrates significant climatic, mainly temperature, correlations with the variation strongly associated with the first discriminant function. These variables overlap with the important ones observed here. Inspection of Howe's plot of discriminant function 1 versus 2 reveals a seriation of groups that corresponds to that obtained here. Geographical groups from cold to tropical areas with the second function, as in the study separating the groups within the broad region. The E series locates in an intermediate position to tropical African and European series. Now, this is important because I'm not going to get into it in this presentation, but the reason it's located in the area between the two is because the tropical Africans today mixed a lot with the pygmies and the San folks. So a lot of the teeth that we have in our mouth and a lot of the forms of our cranials are more intermediate position because they took a lot of traits from the pygmies and the San folks, and then it mixed in with our DNA. But one cluster techniques places it with Africans, another with Europeans. And it's because you have two different techniques they use. And when you have two different techniques, a scientist uses the one that most likely goes with their hypothesis or their theory. And the theory was that all these people in the Near East were European. But we know that's not true. Anyone who does any type of archaeological research, any anthropological research, will clearly see this is not true. And the DNA research, again, will be shown later that shows this. Examination of the principal coordinates plots of Musgrave and Evans reveals a seriation on coordinate 1 that describes a north-south temperature climb within the Mediterranean region. Now, this is important. I'm pointing this out because the Mediterranean population, which a lot of us tell you that includes us, is not only inclusive of the J markers and the K markers, but is also inclusive of our DNA. And like I said, we'll get to that later. The other issue concerns the covariance of metric traits with aspects of morphology not readily described by metrics, i.e. the issue of morphological versus metric approaches and the race concepts in skeletal biology. These are the two approaches I was talking about that they utilize. A concrete example is the following situation. How would one finally classify a skull if on the basis of the metric discriminant function, it classifies in one category, but on easily observed morphological traits, it seemed to fall into another? Which one does one weigh more? And that's just going into like how the scholars themselves can, be very subjective in choosing which one they're going to go with. And a lot of times in ancient times, done by the, not ancient times, but in past times, done by these more racist scholars, they would go with the ones that lean more towards a European traits than it does with the African traits. Okay, now we're going to go on to Wormian bones, because this is very, very important that we get to Wormian bones, because when they're brought up in the next article I give up talking about Lachish, we need to have a good understanding of where do Wormian bones point to, how they come about, and what population they're pointing to. Wormian bones are also called intrasutural bones. These are irregular, isolated bones that appear in addition to the usual centers of ossification of the cranium, and although unusual, are not rare. They occur most frequently in the course of the lambdoid suture, which is right here on the top of the skull, which is more tortuous than other sutures. They are also occasionally seen within the sagittal and coronal sutures. A large Wormian bone at labda is often called an Inca bone due to the relatively high frequency of occurrence in Peruvian mummies. Now, keep in mind that Peruvian mummies have these Inca bones. All right. Unusual presence of Wormian sutural bones in the human skulls by A. Khan, M.A. Asiri, and A. Hassan, Department of Anatomy, School of Medical Sciences, University of Sains, Malaysia. Intro. Wormian or sutural bones are usually small, irregular ossicles located within the cranial sutures. They are formed as a result of alterations in the normal formation of the flat bones on the skull and are usually regarded as normal variants. They are not named because they vary in number and shape from skull to skull. They are studied and reported as ethnic variables. Now note that it's ethnic variables, being an interest to human anatomy, physical anthropology, radiology, and forensic medicine. Pathological and mechanical and genetic factors have been proposed as a primary causal mechanism in the occurrence of Wormian bones. So let's keep in mind the genetic factors, because that's going to be brought up in almost any study you see on Wormian bones, talking about how they may originate. According to some, Wormian bones may be the result of additional ossification centers in the fibrous tissue occurring during late fetal ages and postnatally, and which remain separated from the primary centers of ossification of cranial bones. High frequencies of Wormian bones in some populations and their absence in others geographically nearby or subject to similar environmental stresses suggests a genetic mechanism, because as we're going to see in other presentations, is the only thing that's left on the table. Okay, the discussion. Wormian bones are a common occurrence in the human skull. They occur most frequently in the lambdoid suture. Bergman reported that nearly 40% of skulls have sutural bones in the lambdoid suture. The next most common site of Wormian bones is the Praetorian ossel, which has a high incidence among Indians, East Indians, that is. A study of Saxenia shows that 11.79% of Indian skulls and 5.06% of Nigerian skulls have epiphyteric bone. There can be another bone called a pre-interparietal bone or Inca bone at the lambda. It is still unclear why sutural bones are common in certain races. According, some authors have occurrence of Wormian bones is controlled by genetic factors. Some other studies suggest that the presence of Wormian bones is associated with cranial or central nervous system abnormalities. Radiologists Dr. Frank Galliard and Dr. Amit Tripathi have reported cases of Wormian bone association with rickets, hypothyroidism, Down syndrome, osteogenesis imperfecta, pycnodysostis, and cleidocranial dysplasia. Conversely, Geneti have reported the presence of Wormian bones in 4 fetuses, but none of these cases were associated with any abnormalities. So that kind of throws out that it may be associated with cranial or central nervous system abnormalities. That throws it out because we found it in people that are not associated with any of those abnormalities. Moving on to another presentation. Os Inque, which is another word for Inca bones. A variation in frequency in major human population groups, because we want to pinpoint which populations do we find these Wormian bones in. So when we go back to Lachish and we look at these Wormian bones, we'll know what populations they point to. Okay, and this was done by Tsunehiko Hanihara, Department of Anatomy, Saga Medical School. Hajime Ishida, Department of Anatomy, School of Medicine, University of Ryukyus, Japan. And this is the abstract. The variation in frequency of the Inca bone was examined in major human populations around the world. The New World populations have generally high frequencies of Inca bones, whereas lower frequencies occur in Northeast Asians and Australians. Tibetan, Nepalese, and Assam, Sikkim populations in northeast India have more Inca bones than do neighboring populations. Among modern populations originally derived from East Asian population stock, the frequencies are highest in some of the marginal isolated groups. In Central and West Asia, as well as in Europe, frequency of the Inca bone are relatively low. So that's showing you in these areas, Inca bones aren't around, so we can't have no Europeans in this, and we don't have any Central or West Asians, modern Central or West Asians included in this right now. Right. The incidence of the complete Inca bone is moreover very low in the Western Hemisphere of the Old World, except for sub-Saharan Africa, where all of our research and all of us Hebrews have been telling you this is where our people fled to. And this is actually showing that. Sub-Saharan Africans show as a whole a second peak in the occurrence of the Inca bone. Geographical and ethnographical patterns of the frequency variation of the Inca bone found in this study indicate that the possible genetic background for the occurrence of this bone cannot be completely excluded. So here's another point to genetics being the reason. Relatively high frequencies of Inca bones in sub-Saharan Africans indicate that this trait is not a uniquely Eastern Asian regional character. Now, I got to give a shout out to the mighty Hebrew on this one. You know, I don't agree with everything the man teaches, but on this one, we definitely agree that the ancestors of, but our ancestors as Israelites, before they were in Sumer, and were considered Sumerians, they were in India. And that's why all things point back to India at the end of the day. And this is where a lot of these traditions originated. The town of and Eridu, which are found in Sumer, and are two of the earliest towns ever built in Sumer, were built by scribes from India. And we know that is the land where Abraham came from. And we know that we have these guys who come with these minimalist arguments like Garfield that's trying to say that he's from Turkey or some reason, when everything in the Bible points to him being from Iraq. And even the scholar that he's using, that he wouldn't tell us about, who purports this, even he says that the biblical evidence all points to Iraq. But let's keep this moving. Next article. Bioarchaeological analysis of the cultural transition in the Southern Levant using dental non-metric traits. Now, this right here article is specifically about dental non-metric traits, but it has some very, very important information within it that deals with Wormian bones and the cranials that's found at Lachish. And this was done by Jamie M. Uhlinger, Department of Anthropology, Ohio State University, Susan Guys Sheridan, Department of Anthropology, University of Notre Dame, Diane E. Hawkey, and Christy G. Turner II, Department of Anthropology, Arizona State University. And it was published in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, issue 128, pages 466 through 476 in 2005. All right. Ethnicity. Several investigators proposed the emergence of a new ethnicity rather than the expansion by an outside force. Diver proposed that an ethnic group perpetuates its sense of separate identity by developing rules for maintaining ethnic boundaries, using a shared language and value system that result in biological homeostasis. He saw a significant ethnic distinction between the late Bronze Age Canaanites, who would have inhabited Dothan, and Iron Age Israelites, who would have inhabited Lachish. So he's saying right here that it was Israelites that inhabited Lachish. Some claim that the Israelites were nomadic pastoralists from southern Transjordan mentioned in the Amarna documents of the 14th century BCE, who entered the hill country and returned to an agrarian lifestyle during the early Iron Age. Redford states that although they mimic Canaanite organization and ceramics, they were not Canaanites. However, every Kemetic's favorite is Israeli scholar, Israel Finkelstein, argued that there is little archaeological evidence to identify even an ethnic difference, much less a biological difference between the Bronze and Iron Age inhabitants of the Levant. Now, I actually think there's a little bit credence to be given to Israel Finkelstein, because it's going to be hard to set this distinguishment when you have Israelites who, before they even left the area, were mixing with Canaanites. Therefore, their DNA would be intermingled with us as is. We would both look like each other, which all scholars pretty much say that we do throughout history. So there wouldn't be much to differentiate them, but there should be certain things which the Bible points out that will, and we'll get to them shortly. Block-Smith provoked a heated discussion on the question of ethnicity in this time period by systematically discounting many lines of evidence archaeologists presented as ethnic identifiers. She maintained, however, that Iron Age villages were based on kinship and should be biologically unique, in that's what we're getting to. They are unique, Wormian bones. Lachish. Tel Duer was identified as ancient Lachish, a major city of Judea east of Philistia in the Iron Age II period, 1000 to 586 BCE. Lachish very likely had significant contact with other groups during the Iron Age, located only 6 miles from the nearest Philistine settlement. Traditionally, Philistine occupation was measured by the presence of very distinct ceramics, which goes to Israel Finkelstein misusing those ceramics to come up with his timeline and has all these guys championing it. But they don't realize why they're championing it. He went back and retracted it. So now you're only agreeing, again, with the Solomonic dynasty and establishing it archaeologically. But going forward, however, only 3 such pot shards out of the many thousands recovered were found on the Tel, making it unlikely that Lachish was inhabited by the Sea peoples or the Philistines. Lachish is the subject of large stone reliefs created for the Assyrian king Sennacherib, whose army conquered the area in 701 BCE. The excavators believe that the remaining tombs 107, 108, 116, 117, and 120, which is the important one, is the largest tomb excavated, housing a majority of the skulls and dinner remains, contain individuals who did not survive the attack of the city, so dead Israelites. Lachish remains represent one of the best preserved and largest samples of Middle Eastern crania from any time period, with a near equal distribution of sexes present, which means the Assyrians was killing men, women with no discretion. Indeed, with renewed religious restrictions against the excavation study of human skeletons, the Lachish collection may remain the most representative Iron Age osteological series from the Southern Levant, which is pretty much telling you this is all we got as of the moment. So it's one site, which has been as a known Israelite site, deal with the Judeans being sacked by Sennacherib at Lachish. Let's keep that in mind. In attempts to avoid difficulties inherent in craniometric analysis, non-metric traits are often used for affinity assessment. For example, Finkel concluded that the frequency of accessory Wormian bones of the lamboidal suture in the Lachish skulls was rather high, and that's 63.4%. He stated that stabilizing, selection, inbreeding, and drift led to the frequencies of Wormian bone formation. Now wait for a minute. Selective inbreeding, stabilized selection, inbreeding, and drift are things that will be found in the Israelite population, but by the way we know it was structured from the Bible. They weren't allowed to marry too much an outside people. You would have houses that would marry amongst one another, like the house of Judah. The three great houses would constantly marry amongst one another, which would create a type of inbreeding. It's not incest, but it's a insulated breeding. And the drift comes from well, y'all know how genetic drift is. And also we have the fact that they would, as they conquered other peoples, they would take their women and have children with them to help grow their population. Comparison of Brothwell showed that the trait frequency for Lachish was similar to that of other groups. Now let's see what other groups this is. Smith and Zayas observed 7 of 10 Hellenistic Southern Levantine individuals with Wormian bones. So that lets you know during the Hellenistic period, when our people were in Israel fighting against the Greeks and the Romans, that those people, 7 out of 10 of them had Wormian bones, these Israelites, all right? And Shanklin and Gonctus found that trait in approximately 1/2 of 31 Phoenician skulls, which was 15, which means that half of the Phoenician population were Israelites, which we've been telling people that the Phoenician population was an amalgamation of the northern kingdom Israelites with the Canaanites. All right, let's have a review over what we've seen so far. Soekita exposes apparent dismissal in the classification of the unknown cranial at Lachish, because he was saying that these specific identities were unknown, but they have Wormian bones. And which anyone who does further research knows that in ancient times, what they would do, because these Wormian bones do look like fractures or so, that's how they would classify them, and then use one of the methods to also classify them as European. And if they couldn't get around that, like in Lachish, they would mark them as unknowns. The second one, we have learned not only were there Negroid features among the Lachish remains, which were originally omitted as cranial deformities, but were just Wormian bones or Inca bones. They also tried to attribute the remains of Nubians and Libyans, but there was no hard evidence to support such an hypothesis. We learned that Inca bones are highly frequent in 3 global populations: Southeast Asia, the Indians there, mummies of the Inca civilization of South America, and sub-Saharan Africa. Another thing we learned was there's a genetic link may be the cause of such Wormian bones due to the fact that other populations in the same area under the same stresses, environmental stresses, don't have them. Lastly, we learned that 65%, well, 63.4% of the skulls had Wormian bones at the Lachish site. 7 out of 10 of Hellenistic Israelite skulls have Wormian bones, and 15 out of 13 Phoenician skulls have Wormian bones. So everything that we've gotten so far about Israelites point down to sub-Saharan Africa. But because I don't want to just give you the craniometry, I'm also fit to go in and give you the DNA. Now, maybe some Israelites that don't like this, what I'm going to bring out with the DNA, but just bear with me, tough through it with me, and y'all going to see what I'm saying. And it's going to show how what they love so much, this science they love so much, actually proves our point to the T. But let's keep it going. All right. DNA says that Jews are a race, and this was published in Haaretz magazine. All right. Jews exhibit, he writes, a distinctive genetic signature. Keep that in mind, a distinctive genetic signature. Considered that the Nazis tried to exterminate Jews based on their supposed racial distinctiveness. Such a conclusion might be a cause for concern, but Austere sees it as central to Jewish identity. For most of the 3,000-year history of the Jewish people, the notion of what came to be known as Jewish exceptionalism was hardly controversial. Because of our imagery of intermarriage and cultural isolation imposed and self-selected, Jews were considered by Gentiles and usually referred to themselves as a race. Scholars from Josephus to these Israeli proudly proclaim their membership in the tribe. Now, this picture right here is actually from the Nazis by Time magazine when they did a documentary on the Jews and considered him a bastard because he was practicing African cultures or African traditions, as they would have called it during that time period, and that they were also a mixed race of people. They were mutts, and we know that Hitler did not believe in the mixing of the races. He may have had one of the most culturally diverse and ethnically diverse armies in history during the time of World War II, but he did not believe in the mixing of the races whatsoever. He believed that races should be separated. Going forward, Fishberg fervently embraced the anthropological fashion of the era, measuring skull sizes to explain why Jews seem to be afflicted with more diseases than other groups. Yeah, because they have some diseases that are diseases like sickle cell anemia, which is found in no other European populations. What he called the peculiarities of the comparative pathology of the Jews. It turns out that Fishberg and his contemporary phrenologists were wrong. Skull shape provides limited information about human differences, but his studies ushered in a century of research linking, Jews to genetics. Jews, a people, a religion, or both? Is Judaism a people or a religion, or both? The belief that Jews may be psychologically or physically distinct remains a controversial fixture in the Gentile and Jewish consciousness, and Austere places himself directly in the line of fire. Yes, he writes, the term race carries nefarious associations of inferiority and ranking of people. Anything that marks Jews as essentially different runs the risk of stirring either anti or philo-Semitism. But that doesn't mean we can ignore the factual reality of what he calls the biological basis for Jewishness. Now, keep in mind, this is going to be explaining the biological basis that makes the different Jewish populations Jewish and Jewish genetics. Acknowledging the distinctiveness of Jews is fraught with peril, but we must grapple with the hard evidence of human differences if we seek to understand new age of genetics, which that's true around, period. Because you have people sitting there trying to say that all races are the same when it's very clear we can look at each other and see that we're distinct and different. Let's not be foolish. It's stamped on our DNA, as Oyster explains in fascinating detail. Threads of Jewish ancestry linked to the sizable Jewish communities of North America and Europe to Yemenite and other Middle Eastern Jews who have relocated to Israel, as well as the Black Limba of Southern Africa, and to India's Cochin Jews, which are Black. People need to look them up. But in a twist, the links include neither the Bene Israel of India nor Ethiopian Jews. Genetic tests show that both groups are converts, contradicting their founding myths. Now, I know there's some Israelites that agree that the Ethiopian Jews are Israelites, and there's some that disagree. It seems clear from the evidence they're converts. Now, does that mean that that may not be some actual Israelites mixed in there, or they may not descend from real Israelites? It's not saying that. It's just saying they don't. It's making it clear that the genetic marker that is making the Jewish people a distinct population is just not there. And we're going to find out what that genetic marker is later. And I'm pretty sure y'all know what it is. All right. Further evidence of refugee migrations. Now, in part one of the presentation, I brought up the Guanches, who were the people who fled from the Levant area, went down into Carthage, and then Carthage put out a few ships with 30,000 people and took them into the Canary Islands in West Africa to populate these areas. And right here where the arrow is at, we'll start there. In brief, the story describes how before 500 BCE, Hanno set out with 60 ships containing not less than 30,000 men and women who were to be planted in colonies around the west coast of Africa to relieve the population of Carthage. It would seem that he reached the Canary Islands and left most of the burden of his population there. These presumably provide the basis for the people we know today as the Guanches. And I just wanted to bring them up because we're going to get into their DNA a little bit. I thought about leaving this part out, but I'm going to go ahead and do it. Ancient mitochondrial analysis of the origin of the Guanches. The abstract. The prehistoric colonization of the Canary Islands by the Guanches, native Canarians, woke up great expectation about their origins. Since the European conquest of the archipelago, here we report mitochondrial DNA analysis of Aborigine remains around 1,000 years old. The sequences retrieved show that the Guanches possess U6B1 lineages that are in the present-day Canarian population, but not in Africans. In turn, U6B, the phylogenetically closest ancestor found in Africa, is not present in the Canary Islands. Comparisons with other populations relate the Guanches with the actual inhabitants of the archipelago and with Moroccan Berbers. This shows that despite the continuous changes suffered by the population, Spanish colonization, slave trade, Aboriginal mitochondrial DNA lineages constitute a considerable portion of the Canarian gene pool. Although the Berbers are the most probable ancestors of the Guanches, it is deduced that the important human movements have reshaped Northwest Africa after the migratory wave to the Canary Islands. That's pretty much telling you that Northwest Africa wasn't the same after the Europeans invaded it. So the populations there aren't the same populations. And that's important to know because clearly they pushed them south. Introduction. Since the incorporation of the Canary Islands to the European world in the 15th century, the origin and survival of these Aboriginal inhabitants has been a debatable topic. Population genetic studies on the present-day inhabitants, mainly those based in uniparental markers, have given support to the most probable Northwest African Berber origin of the Guanches, as the native Canarians were generally known. Mitochondrial DNA lineage such as U6 and Y chromosome markers as M81 with a Berber origin have a significant higher presence in the Canary Islands than in Iberians, the main colonizers of the islands. Admixture analysis taking the Iberians, Northwest and West Sub-Saharan African populations as parental sources for the actual Canarian population gave estimates of around 33% for the mitochondrial and 6% for the parental Guanche lineages. This strong sexual asymmetry was explained as a result of long bias favoring mating between European males and Aborigine females, and to the important Aboriginal male mortality during the conquest. Because, of course, they come through, they kill all the males and marry the women. That's just what they do. Well, they say they're marrying, but we know what they really do. However, these results, although congruent with history, are susceptible to criticism because we have to criticize things. That's what science does. First of all, as the Berber markers are also present in the Iberian Peninsula, drift effects after the Spanish colonization could justify the higher frequencies in the Canary Islands without invoking Aboriginal heritage. Furthermore, after the conquest, the need of labor led to the introduction of slaves from the northwest African coast. With time, these slaves were freed and integrated into the population. This could justify the presence in the current Carninian gene pool of the higher amount of Berber markers than the Iberian Peninsula. And they're pretty much just questioning the Berber origin of it, of course, like he said. However, the geographic distribution of U6 subclades in Africa and the Canary Islands weakens this statement. In Northwest Africa, the predominant subgroup is U6A, which is scarce in the archipelago. On the other hand, subgroup U6B is very rare in North Africa, but the sublineage U6B1 is most prevalent of the U6 subhaplogroups in the Canarian population and has not been detected in North Africa. Certainly, the straight way to confirm the Aboriginal contribution to the current mitochondrial gene pool of the archipelago would be to check for the presence of the Canarian U6B1 subclade directly on the Aboriginal remains of the island. Fortunately, the advances in molecular biology have made the retrieval of ancient DNA from archaeological specimens a tenable goal, especially if the remains are probably less than 1,000 years old. So when people are trying to go beyond 1,000 years and make it seem like everything is right, exact, it's not. It's a hypothesis, it's a guess, and the way they do this is very, very hard to actually extract the DNA, the polymorphisms, and use in order to reconstruct it. So don't let people tell you that they got 10,000-year-old DNA that they can reconstruct. It's just not happening. The discussion. The high diversity found in the Guanches comparable to the present-day Canarian and to continental Northwest Africa population is against the idea that the Aboriginal settlement implies strong founder effects from Northwest Africa. It is congruent with the great ethnic diversity of the Guanches and or the existence of several differentiated migratory waves to the Canary Islands before European conquest, which means different people were just migrating to the island. I mean, after the island was populated, of course, they would have traded with different people, so on and so forth. It's just natural human interactions. They would have definitely traded back with Carthage. The detection in the Guanches of the most abundant haplotype of U61B branch, also found in present-day Ireland, points to a significant continuity of the Aboriginal maternal gene pool. However, in contrast to the overall diversity detected, the North African U6 representatives in the Guanches are only of two types. Today's U6B1 lineages have only been sporadically found in two Moroccans, a Wolof, a Fulbe, and in the Iberian Peninsula. This wide distribution could be compatible with the idea of U6B lineages were present in the past. In all of this Western area, but posterior demographic movements reshaped its genetic landscape. The fact that 4 out of the 6 private Aboriginal haplogroups belong to the African L cluster reinforces this idea, which anyone knows that the L cluster, that's us. But moving on to the next. Population genetics reveals shared ancestry. DNA links modern European Middle Easterns to sub-Saharan Africans, which again is how they classify us. And the publisher of this was Science Daily, May 24, 2011. The sources from Harvard Medical School. I actually have this report, but I'm not going to go into it in detail in this presentation. Materials provided by Harvard Medical School, so on and so forth. More than just a tool for predicting health, modern genetics is upending long-held assumptions about who we are. See, it's upending them, which means all these genetics that they've been talking about in all these past time periods that all you guys like to reference, all that's getting overturned with the new developments in science. A recent study cast new light on the intermingling and migration of European, Middle Eastern, and African and populations since ancient times. For most analysis, we use HapMap 3, Utah European American CEU, which they're used to represent Northern Europeans because, you know, the Mormons in Utah did not believe in intermingling with other peoples. So they kept their genetics isolated, so they're using them to represent Northern Europeans, of course, and HapMap 3 Yoruba Nigerians to represent Sub-Saharan Africans, although we have verified the robustness of our inferences using alternative populations, which means they've used a vast array of Sub-Saharan African populations. And then HapMap 3 Yoruba is Nigeria, Ibadan, Nigeria, and that is home of the Oyo state of the Yoruba, which is again Ibadan, Nigeria, or the Oyo state is the capital of it, and it's the same people that Derek Lang said were descended from Israelites in his peer-reviewed article that I spoke on in the last presentation. In a paper titled, and this is the paper, or this is actually the paper, The History of African Gene Flow into the Southern Europeans, Levantines, and Jews, published in PLOS ONE Genetics, Harvard Medical School Associate Professor of Genetics David Reich and his colleagues investigate the proportion of Sub-Saharan African ancestry present in various populations of West Eurasia, defined as the geographic area spanning modern Europe and the Middle East. While previous studies have established that such shared ancestry exists, see, previous studies already said that we were there in those areas. They have not indicated to what degree and how far back the mixing of populations can be traced. Analyzing publicly available genetic data from 40 populations comprising North Africans, Middle Easterners, and Central Asians were doctoral student Priya Morjani and Alkees Price, an associate professor in the program in molecular and genetic epidemiology within the Department of Epidemiology at the Harvard School of Public Health. Morjani traces genetic ancestry using a method called roll-off. This platform, developed by Reich Lab, compares the size and composition of stretches of DNA between human populations as a mean of estimating when they mixed. The smaller and more broken up the DNA segments, the older the date of admixture. Very basic, straightforward. Morjani uses the technique to examine the genomes of modern West Eurasian populations to find signatures of Sub-Saharan African ancestry. She did this by looking for chromosomal segments in West Eurasian DNA that closely match those of Sub-Saharan Africans. By plotting the distribution of these segments and estimating their rate of genetic decay, Reich's lab was able to determine the proportion of African genetic ancestry still present and to infer approximately when the West Eurasian and Sub-Saharan African populations mix. The genetic decay happens very slowly, Morjani explained. So today, thousands of years later, there is enough evidence for us to estimate the date of population mixture. While the researchers detected no African genetic signature in Northern European populations, they found a distinct presence of African ancestry in Southern Europe, the Moors, of course, Middle Eastern, and Jewish populations. Modern Southern European groups can attribute about 1 to 3% of their genetic signature to African ancestry. Now, these are estimates of it overall, so different groups have different time frames. Dating back to 55 generations, on average, that is roughly 1,600 years ago. So everybody knows that's around about 400 AD, during the time when the Moors were really pushing into that area. But that's another argument. Middle Eastern groups have inherited about 4 to 15%, with the mixing of population dating back roughly 32 generations. Now, this is more aligned with the sub-Saharan slave trade on that one. A diverse array of, which this is the important one, a diverse array of Jewish populations can date their sub-Saharan African ancestry back roughly 72 generations, on average accounting to 3 to 5% of their genetic makeup today. According to Reich, these findings address a long-standing debate over African multicultural influences in Europe, because what you have is during like the Tudor dynasties, the Stuart dynasties in England and in different places in Europe, you have these strong African influence that everyone's trying to figure out where it came from. It came from Africans. The dates of population mixtures are consistent with documented historical events, which again goes with the Moors and the Arab conquest. For example, the mixing of African and Southern European population coincides with events during the Roman Empire and Arab migrations that followed. And we know that during the Roman Empire, they dispersed Israelites all over the empire. And this would account for a lot of this mixture. And plus, even in earlier times, Israelites set up trade colonies in all of these places that eventually grew into cities. The older mixture dates among African and Jewish populations are consistent with events in biblical time, such as the Jewish diaspora that occurred in 8th and 6th century BCE. Reich was surprised, which this right here means that our DNA, in which we would argue that our presence, and also the cranials argue, we were the Israelites. And with this evidence being put forth now, it's really no arguing this. This is like the most concrete argument you can put forth to prove that we are Israelites. And this goes back to, again, the Assyrian dispersion, which in 701 BCE, and the Babylonian dispersal, that before these time periods, we were there mixing amongst these people we're calling Jewish. Anyway, Reich was surprised to see any level of shared ancestry between Ashkenazi and non-Ashkenazi groups. I've never been convinced that they were actually related to each other. Reich says, but he now concludes that his last finding have significant cultural and genetic implication. Population boundaries that many people think were impermeable are in fact not that way. And what he's pretty much saying is the only thing that links these separate Jewish populations to one another is this sub-Saharan African ancestry. Now, I'm not a genius by any means, but if the only common denominator between different groups that claim a heritage is sub-Saharan African ancestry, that would mean that today we would categorize the Israelites as sub-Saharan African. This is simply just retracing the DNA to its origin. And its origin has to be in people that we call sub-Saharan African if the only thing that connects these different populations is this sub-Saharan African DNA found in the Oyo state Yoruba, showing that their ancestors intermixed with these Jewish peoples. And the funny thing about the different Jewish diasporas is, in all other regards, these different Jewish populations are just like the people that they're mixed amongst. So the Ashkenazi Jew, most of their DNA is Northern European DNA, except where it comes down to sub-Saharan African. Same thing with the Druze Jewish groups, and many other different dispersed Jewish groups. This is just a matter of fact at this point. All right. Genes tell the tale of Jews' ties to Africa. It was in a publication before by Gianna Palmer. It's pretty much different interviews. Subject matter is the same article. Now, a new scientific paper offers a genetic timeline that could support these biblical tales. The paper builds on 2 studies published last summer that were the first to use genome-wide analysis to trace the history of the Jewish people through DNA. It demonstrates that there was a biological basis for Jewishness, which we've seen beforehand was the trait of the Oyo State Yoruba, or the Oyo Ife Yoruba, which Derek Lang said descend from Israelites, and gave it was a peer-reviewed article, which Rabborn Allah tried to lie and say it wasn't, which they said he did it with empirical data. But anyway, by Dr. Harry Oyster, director of the Human Genetics Program at the New York University School of Medicine, who led one of the studies. Among many findings, Oyster's papers indicate that Jews have African ancestry, an observation that David Reich, associate professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School, and his colleagues decided to explore further. Reich's team analyzed more than 500,000 DNA markers across the entire genome of the peoples from 7 diverse Jewish populations, including Ashkenazim from Northern Europe, Sephardim from Italy, Turkey, and Greece, Mizraim from Syria, Iraq, and Iran. They then compared the genetic data with DNA from 15 sub-Saharan African populations. So the finding, Morjani said, may point to a shared ancestry among various Jewish populations. It's definitely suggests that most Jewish populations have a common ancestral population, she said, which is again sub-Saharan Africans. Like this, it's crazy that you have people like the Dagger Squad that won't even look at the scholarship we put forward because they know they can't refute it. It's crazy. They just want to argue. They're trying to make a name off going against Hebrew Israelites. Look, Garfield, you ain't polite. All right? Just give it up. You ain't finna make a name off us. We not finna run down that same rabbit hole. We learned from that. We gonna hold y'all to a standard. So here's the deal. Before you come over here talking about Israelites, they don't know what they talking about, all that. How about this? You say you descend from the Akan. Why don't you go study Naomi? Find out his different cultural values that he has for his people, so on and so forth. Then come back to us and let's compare and contrast. Let's see, maybe we may find an area where we can agree on some things. But don't sit here and come down on my heritage when you don't even know your own. That's just shameful. Yet, even though the biblical accounts offer possible explanation for the Reich's lab's finding, Schiffman stresses that he and other social scientists can only offer historical interpretations of the genetic data. The facts are the ones that scientists are developing. The theories are what historians have, he said. We now have to take what they have, what they are giving us, and we have to add it to our picture of history. As Reich sees it, genetic and history are not actually so disparate. His work, he says, is a kind of complementary way of studying history. So what they're pretty much saying is you got to combine the two. You can't do one against the other. They're supposed to run parallel to one another. Genetics just helps substantiate our history. And what genetics has helped substantiate for Israel is, or that us in America that claim that we are Hebrew Israelites, or we descend from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is that it's true. The DNA bears it out. You can't get around it. The same DNA that's found in these sub-Saharan Africans is found in 78% of us African, quote unquote, African Americans. And it's the same DNA that's found in these dispersed Jewish populations. The common denominator between them all is us. Game, set, match, man. It's over. There's nothing else to really even talk about on this subject, real talk. So with that, man, I'm going to get ready to go ahead and close this up. Now, if Dagger Squad don't want to be cowards and keep running every time one of us step up and take their challenge, they keep saying, oh, we challenging all these Hebrew Israelites, they scared. I done been on your show 3, 4, 5 times, manhandling y'all. Y'all couldn't even get around what I was saying. Y'all just start acquiescing and agreeing and trying to find little petty things to argue about. You're just petty fogging on dumb stuff because that's what y'all do, because y'all not real scholars. You try to search and find one little point that we may be mistaken on, or maybe a gray area where you can zoom in on that point and try to act like refuting one point refutes the hundreds of other points that's put forth. It makes no sense. But anyway, I'm tired. Got to get up early in the morning. It's late. So shalom, Israel. Again, thank y'all for coming in and tuning in to Maccabeestv. And shout out to all the Israelites out there putting in their work. Ron Divine Prospect, big shout out to you, bro. Vocab Malone, he was ready to cry after that presentation. We seen what he was doing on Facebook after all that crying and stuff. Captain Tazariak and Chatazak. I tuned into y'all channel, Israelite Vibes, man. Oh man, that presentation y'all gave on Paul, powerful, bro. Powerful, bro. Keep putting in that work, man, because the next place we taking our sights is over here to these Christians, man, because they the ones that's really deceiving our people. Let's just be real about it. Kemet, yeah, y'all got a nice little community, but y'all ain't big like us. I mean, 5 years ago, they were saying we're 100,000 strong, and I know we still growing. So when y'all ready to deal with real scholarship, real history, real archaeology, and y'all really want to know the truth, come over here to Maccabeestv. Deal with us, because we on some real scholarship. None of that biased stuff. So peace. Shalom, Israel. Have a great night.